In mid-2019, the Trump administration signed asylum cooperative agreements with the countries of the Central American Northern Triangle, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. These agreements meant that asylum seekers arriving at the US border could be sent to these countries to claim asylum there instead. Such agreements were criticized by many human rights organizations for putting asylum seekers in danger. The weak rule of law and the prevalence of international gangs operating in this region meant that asylum seekers faced the same dangers they were trying to escape, notably violence, corruption, and poverty. So what is the basis for these agreements? Outsourcing asylum is a broad label that covers various strategies employed by wealthy countries, predominantly in the global north, which aim to limit the amount of asylum seekers and other migrants that reach them. These destination countries utilize transit or third countries and the countries of origin themselves as a means to inhibit the movement of migrants. Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. Whilst the UDHR is a non-binding agreement, the right to leave any country, including their own, is enshrined in international law, notably Article 12 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Preventing people from leaving a country where they are in danger or cannot find protection infringes on their right to leave to seek asylum. One of the tactics employed by destination countries is the use of carrier sanctions, which prevent those without visas or documents from traveling regularly. As many asylum seekers do not have documentation, such as passports, and are unable to obtain visas, their ability to travel safely and lawfully on aeroplanes or ferries is severely limited. Thus, they are faced with a very difficult choice: stay where they are and face unsafe conditions, or flee the harm and face danger as they travel. Only a very small number of refugees, about 1%, are resettled through the UNHCR or through private sponsorship. For the vast majority, the system gives them no other option but to travel or be contained. Under international human rights and refugee law, when migrants reach a destination country by foot or sea or come into contact with that country, for example when intercepted at sea or at the border, that country owes them human rights obligations. Reaching the border of a desired country or making contact with officials allows asylum seekers to assert their claim. Importantly, people have some choice of where they claim asylum. International law provides no requirements for people to claim asylum in the first safe country they pass through. Indeed, these transit countries are often unsafe and provide no real protection to the asylum seekers. Another tactic used is the interception of migrants en route by the destination countries. For example, the USA has used Guantanamo Bay to hold migrants intercepted at sea. They have locked up tens of thousands of people, mainly Haitians and Cubans, in detention centers with no access to lawyers and in squalid conditions. This policy of interception has been adopted by other countries around the world as destination countries learn from each other. For instance, Australia uses offshore detention centers in Papua New Guinea and Nauru. In Mexico, the creation of urban detention centers have inhibited the movement of migrants and have been used as a deterrent. These detention camps have extremely poor living conditions, and they force the people detained there into a choice of whether to return to awful conditions in their home country or remain in awful conditions in the detention centers. This degrading treatment has led to much criticism of the centers, including that of American politician Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has called them concentration camps. More recently, however, there has been a shift. Destination countries no longer carry out as many interceptions themselves, but rather they provide the funds, training, and equipment to transit and source countries so that they carry out the interceptions instead. For instance, between 2011 and 2017, the USA spent more than $100 million to secure Mexico's southern border. This money was spent on equipment, training, and the posting of American officials at the border. Other states such as Italy, with EU backing and support, have followed suit by equipping countries such as Libya so that they can carry out interceptions and pullbacks of migrants at sea. Thus, there has been a trend of destination countries seeking to shift the responsibility for the migrants to other countries. The shifting of responsibility is not always done on an entirely voluntary basis. Third countries are often incentivized or threatened to cooperate. Third countries can be incentivized with trade concessions, labor visas, and development aid that is tied to migration control. Conversely, they can be threatened with measures such as tariffs. For example, in May 2019, President Trump threatened to impose tariffs on Mexican exports if they did not curb a surge in immigration. As a result, Mexico mobilized 25,000 National Guards to police its borders. Actions such as this make it difficult to determine who bears responsibility for the migrants. It can be argued that because the USA directs and controls countries such as Mexico and provides the funding, training, and even patrol officers alongside incentives and threats, this arguably reaches the level of control necessary for the US as a destination country to be held responsible for human rights violations that occur as a result. Outsourcing asylum is not necessarily unlawful in of itself, as long as the migrants have true access to safety and international standards are upheld. Accords such as the Asylum Cooperative Agreements with the countries of the Northern Triangle provide a more complicated picture. International human rights law, refugee law, and customary international law, which the US must uphold, enshrines the obligation of non-refoulement. This obligation guarantees that no one should be returned to a country where they would face torture, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, and other irreparable harm. There is a general consensus that the nations of the Northern Triangle do not meet the basic requirements regarding freedom from persecution or serious harm to be regarded as safe third countries. Human rights violations that occur in these third countries are well documented. Many of those who are coming to the US seeking asylum are fleeing harm in the very region that the United States planned to send them back to. Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador were each among the top countries from which asylum was granted in the US. A person seeking asylum from Honduras would not be any safer in Guatemala or El Salvador. The New York Times reported that only about 2% of the Central Americans sent to Guatemala actually applied for sanctuary there. Supporters of the asylum cooperation agreements point to this as evidence that their asylum cases had little merit. They say that because the migrants did not even apply for asylum in Guatemala, it shows they would not have had a strong enough case to apply for asylum in the US. However, migrants and their advocates argue that the low number of applicants demonstrates the dangers that vulnerable people face in Guatemala. For some, it is safer to return to their home countries where at least they have family and friends who can help to shield them from danger. This is why the asylum cooperative agreements became known as deportation with a layover. So what next for asylum seekers in this region? Whilst the Trump administration attacked the asylum and immigration system like no president before, the outsourcing of asylum, or more generally the outsourcing of migration control to Central American countries, is not new. But how can such policies be tackled? Whereas the European Court of Human Rights oversees such matters in Europe, countries such as the USA face little restraint. To enact change, pressure has to be applied internationally through diplomacy and sanctions, or internally through their own court system. Thus, in January 2020, a coalition of groups led by the American Civil Liberties Union filed suit against the Trump administration as they argued that the asylum cooperative agreements violated American and international law by failing to protect asylum seekers from exposure to harm in Central America. In February 2021, the Biden administration ended the arrangement, a move warmly welcomed by bodies such as the UNHCR. Whilst the asylum cooperative agreements are officially over, other externalization measures are being put in place by the Biden administration. In April 2021, the USA reached agreements with Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras to secure their borders, whilst humanitarian assistance was also discussed. As such, these countries are incentivized with development aid conditional on securing their borders. In other words, the US is still in part continuing to seek to avoid responsibility for asylum seekers.